With a mounting national chorus decrying police brutality against Black Americans, there's a new call for deep structural reform of policing across the country.
In the wake of the George Floyd killing at the hands of law enforcement, calls for defunding and demilitarizing the police are gaining momentum. In cities like Minneapolis, where Floyd died under the knee of a policeman, officials are discussing moving funds from police departments into healthcare, mental health, and other community programs. New York City's budget received unprecedented attention when protesters camped out in front of City Hall ahead of the deadline to demand $1 billion in cuts to the NYPD's $5.9 billion budget. Public protests continue to put pressure on cities to slash police budgets, raising the question, how did America's police departments acquire so much in funding in the first place? A quick look at the history of policing. After Reconstruction, the slave patrols morphed into local police departments determined to enforce Jim Crow laws to control Black people. Police unions really began consolidating power in the 1950s in response to activists pushing for police reform. Fighting against oversight and advocating fiercely for their own ranks, they developed strict rules that remain in place for most police forces today. Police power continued to expand after the 1960s civil rights movement. The 1965 Law Enforcement Assistance Act, part of President Johnson's administration's war on crime, paved the way for militarization and funding by increasing federal involvement in local policing through grants. The support for local law enforcement from the federal government continued to grow, with a series of laws passed under subsequent presidents, from Reagan to Trump, that further aligned police departments with the military and perpetuated funding. According to FBI statistics, the country's violent crime rate has fallen by half since 1993, somewhat in part to an officer hiring surge in the 90s, paid for by the federal government, which had a modest downward effect on crime during that decade. In the 1990s, violent policing of communities of color escalated as part of a theory known as broken windows. The theory states that signs of disorder and vandalism in a neighborhood lead to more serious criminal activity. It gave police a reason to crack down on misdemeanors and led to NYC's infamous stop and frisk policy. Since the early 90s, more than $7 billion worth of excess U.S. military equipment has been transferred from the Department of Defense to federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, free of charge, as part of its 1033 program. Grants and programs like this have seemingly given some departments the air of armed paramilitary regiments, instead of friendly neighborhood patrols. Another result of police militarization is the rise of special weapons and tactics teams and so-called no-knock raids in search of illegal drugs. Police SWAT raids jumped from 3,000 a year in the early 1980s to 45,000 by 2007.
Rallies across this country, they are shouting another name as well, Breonna Taylor.
In March, Breonna Taylor, whose name has also become a rallying cry for Black Lives Matter activists, was killed by Louisville, Kentucky police, who entered her apartment with a no-knock warrant. Meanwhile, between 1993 and 2017, the average spending on policing by the nation's 150 largest cities grew 42%. After the grant money ran out in 2000 and the hiring push slowed, the impact on crime remained low. Yet by 2017, state and local government spending on police reached $115 billion. So how exactly are these growing police budgets being spent? Salaries are by far the biggest line items on the budget, accounting for at least 2/3 of police budgets nationally. With overtime and benefits included, personnel expenditures could account for as much as 90% of police budgets. Proponents of the movement to defund police departments would like to see money redirected to community services, like schools, housing, social services, and health programs. As funding for social safety net programs has decreased over the years, police officers are being called to situations they are ill-equipped to handle. This includes calls involving the homeless, people with mental illness, and drug addictions. The average police department spends 168 hours training new recruits on firearms, self-defense, and the use of force tactics, according to a 2013 Justice Department report. The department spends just 9 hours on conflict management and mediation. Police unions increasingly have taken a more central role within departments. Police compensation has grown in lockstep with the power of police unions. It's not just salary and pensions they negotiate. Increasingly, the unions help advocate for the rights of officers facing discipline. Many experts say that unions have played a leading role in blocking reform efforts and shielding officers from punishment for misconduct. In the end, even if activists fail in their efforts to restructure policing, law enforcement budgets still aren't safe from cuts. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, state budgets are headed for a loss of $615 billion over the next 3 years, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And that figure doesn't include the hit that local and municipal governments will take, especially since they rely so heavily on state governments for funding. So while President Trump himself has said there will be no defunding of police, his refusal thus far to help state and local governments may actually force the cuts.